Okay, we're going to look at Why We Crave Horror Movies by Stephen King. Usually we go over this in a face-to-face setting and we can have a lot of interaction about the text. I am going to offer this video, which you can watch in a asynchronous setting at your own pace and then ask questions once we get to class. Just like every other essay we've looked at in the class, this is a model. So it's written by a professional. Of course, Stephen King is famous for his work, but it is a great model of expository writing that's accessible for first year composition students. You can do what Stephen King has done in terms of content, organization, style, and mechanics. Uh, in all of those four areas, Stephen King has been successful and really invites you to write about your own topics in a way he's written about his topic to be successful in the same way. And remember that those four areas, content, organization, style, and mechanics, make up our rubric. Those are the four areas in our rubric that we use for assessing essays. So Stephen King's work here is about horror movies. So he's meeting that first principle of expository writing. He's writing about something he really knows. And he's going to tell us what we don't already know. Why do we love horror movies? Once you start digging into that question a little bit, it's kind of strange, right? Why do we love seeing, particularly some of the really gore horror movies? Why do we really enjoy watching people be torn apart? This piece is from the 80s, which is way before a lot of you were born, but it captures some modern phenomenons as well. The recent zombie craze, which is actually kind of dying off a little bit now, but the whole Walking Dead phenomenon and the way in which our culture was really captured by the zombie uh, uh, phenomenon really taps into what Stephen King talks about in this piece and trying to explore why. So that's a great expository mode. Why we crave something, why the reasons for something is something that you could do in your own work, and we'll talk about how that can be accomplished. Let's start at the beginning with the piece. I think we're all mentally ill. Those of us outside the asylums only hide it a little better, and maybe not all that much better after all. He's starting with um, a controversial statement. I think we're all mentally ill, right? Immediately trying to evoke in his audience a response of, yeah, you got that right. Or, of course, we're not all mentally ill. And to use loaded language like mentally ill is very intentional on his part. Um, he continues taking us into his topic about horror movies and his approach and his reasoning for why we crave horror movies with some great description. And because it's Stephen King, he does some stuff that intentionally is supposed to make us squirm. We've all known people who talk to themselves, people who sometimes squinch their faces into horrible grimaces when they believe no one is watching, people who have some hysterical fear of snakes, the dark, the tight place, the long drop. So notice the power of a list here. We've talked about listing in the class. Snakes, the dark, the tight place, the long drop. And then he uses a description that's supposed to make us squirm. The final worms and grubs that are waiting so patiently underground. When I've read that in class before, there's been students who've giggled or smiled or laughed at that line. And of course, it's referencing the body decomposing after it's been buried, and worms and grubs associated with that decomposition, which is super gross. It shouldn't make us smile. And yet I know there are people sitting in the audience smiling. That act is exactly what Stephen King is talking about, right? Saying something gross and having us react. When we pay our $4 or $5 and seat ourselves in 10th row center in a theater show, we are daring the nightmare. That's essentially his thesis. We know he's going to explore, well, why do we dare this? He does an interesting thing as a writer. He lists and describes the simple and obvious reasons. Now, I've told you expository writing is supposed to tell us what we don't already know, but a technique you can use is to tell us what we do already know, right? And you kind of get out there, hey, this is what everybody already knows, and you're leading your audience to, here's my idea that's a little different. So he essentially says that it's like riding a roller coaster, right? That it's a thrill, the danger of it we like. It has been it's a way to add excitement to our lives. And then he starts getting more expository. He's leading into his point that most people don't realize. He says, we go to reestablish our feelings of essential normality. A horror movie is innately conservative and reactionary. Frida Jackson as the horrible melting woman in Die Monster Die confirms for us that no matter how far we may be removed from the beauty of a Robert Redford or a Diana Ross, we are still light years from true ugliness. Now, this uses some cultural allusions that reveal its age, right? First of all, back up to the top, $4 or $5. It doesn't cost $4 or $5 to go to the movie. It costs 15 or 20 bucks to go to the movie. So this was quite a while ago. Frida Jackson and this movie Die Monster Die. For the 80s audience, they would have recognized that as a famous horror movie with an image of a melting woman. And it's funny to me, Robert Redford and Diana Ross are cultural illusions I know right off the top of my head, and many of my students don't. Robert Redford in his time was a sex symbol, as was Diana Ross. Students have told me it's kind of like the modern day Brad Pitt and Beyonce. I don't know if that's really true, but that's what younger people have told me. The point he makes here is that when we see Frida Jackson or other people in horror movies and terrible things that happen to them, we feel good about being ourselves, even though we're not a Robert Redford or a Diana Ross. Then he's got an interesting paragraph, a sentence. It's actually a fragment all by itself, but he isolates it as a single sentence, a great demonstration that breaking grammar rules sometimes can have a really good effect. He says, we go to have fun. And most of us will nod at that. Yeah, horror movies are fun. Well, when you really think about it, horror movies should not be fun. Fun is not a word we should associate with it, right? And he acknowledges that. He says the ground starts to slope away because it's a very peculiar sort of fun. The fun comes from seeing others menaced, sometimes killed. One critic has suggested that pro football has become the voyeur's version of combat, then the horror film has become the modern version of the public lynching. That's a very evocative sentence. Of course, using a word like public lynching, lynching is an act of murdering people in public as an act of mob violence, and it has very strong racial overtones, usually associated with African Americans being lynched by white Americans. So he uses another comparison here. He says football is like combat. So we like watching combat. If you turn on the History Channel at any point during the day, you'll realize this because it's a lot of combat. Action movies full of combat. So another way we can see something like combat is to watch football. Public lynchings were clearly something that we as a society liked because they were common and they were well attended. I mean, even if you think back to the Middle Ages, an execution was public. You took your kids to it. You know, people sold popcorn at it. This wanting to see violence upon others is a very strong part of our psyche. You want to know a great demonstration of this is America's Funniest Home Videos. I bet many of you have watched people hurt themselves in really serious ways, and we laugh at it. For a while on the internet, there was a craze of watching people hurt themselves that were texting, right? They walk into somebody's texting in a mall, and they walk into the into the water fountain in the middle of the mall. The scene violence or seeing people hurt. We replay injuries when we watch sporting events. We slow down as we drive by accidents, hoping to see something. This is innate in us, this interest in seeing others menaced or hurt. And Stephen King is saying, well, why? And then what role does horror movies, his own profession, play in this? It's true. So he starts exploring some of those answers. Why? It's true that the mythic fairy tale horror film intends to take away the shades of gray. Okay, so there's one reason. In a horror film, we like them because it's really clear who's the bad guy and it's really clear who's the good guy, right? The bad guys usually look bad, right? I think about some famous ones like Freddy Krueger or Jason, right? It's clear who the bad guys are. When you're a zombie, it's clear you're a zombie. So this simplicity of hating the bad guys is something we enjoy because we don't get to do that very often. It's not, our lives are not black and white. People aren't all bad or all good. And this ability in a horror movie to lapse into that all good or all bad is attractive. It's part of why we go. He returns to his original point. If we're all insane, then sanity becomes a matter of degree. You may carve up women like Jack the Ripper and we'll clap you away in the funny farm. If, on the other hand, your insanity leads you to talk to yourself or pick your nose, then you're left alone to go about your business. The potential lyncher is in almost all of us. So here's where he's really getting to things we don't normally think about when we think about why do we love horror movies. It's because the potential lyncher is in all of us. And every now and then he has to be let loose to scream and roll around on the grass. So that's one of his reasons, one of his insights. Now, how is he going to get you to feel, know, and believe that the potential lyncher is in all of us? He gives us some details and descriptions. Our emotions and fears form their own body, and we recognize it demands its own exercise. So, how can he prove that our emotions need to be exercised? Well, he's going to talk about some of the positive emotions, right? Love, friendship, loyalty, kindness. Those are all emotions that we applaud, and we exercise them. He has another cultural illusion here that these emotions have been immortalized in the couplets of Hallmark cards and in the verses, I don't dare call it poetry, of Leonard Nimoy. Now, many of my students know what Hallmark is, and Hallmark cards have kind of gushy, romantic expressions of love and friendship. Leonard Nimoy, many of you won't recognize necessarily. Maybe if I do this, you'll recognize Leonard Nimoy. Leonard Nimoy is the actor who played Spock, the original Spock, and his verse of love, friendship, and loyalty and kindness was, wait for it, live long and prosper, right? So that expression of a positive emotion. So we get a scenario here. King says when we exhibit these emotions, we celebrate it, right? When you hug your rotten little puke of a sister, you get candy, right? But if we deliberately slam the rotten little puke of a sister's finger in the door, sanctions follow. Oh, right? We get punished for hurting other people. And yet, the potential lyncher is in all of us, right? He says these anti-civilization emotions don't go away. They demand periodic exercise. That's where horror movies play this role. They help us exercise the bad feelings that we all have so that we can treat them in healthy ways. Here's a sick joke, which is super offensive, okay? Offensive warning here. What's the difference between a truckload of bowling balls and a truckload of dead babies? You can't unload a truckload of bowling balls with a pitchfork. That's disgusting. I've told that joke in class many times, and I almost always have over 50% of the class laughs. And in fact, dead baby jokes are a genre. I regularly have somebody who says, oh, I know other dead baby jokes. The fact that there is a genre of dead baby jokes proves Stephen King's point, okay? There's something wrong in humanity, and horror movies tap into it. Such a joke may surprise a laugh or grin out of us even as we recoil, a possibility that confirms the thesis. If we share a brotherhood of man, we also share an insanity of man. We know there are insane people out there who do bad things. those same emotions are in us and we got to deal with them, right? That's what a horror movie helps us do. It almost becomes a huge advertisement for horror movies, which is really ironic when you think about Stephen King and the fact that that's how he made his living. The mythic horror movie, like The Sick Joke, has a dirty job to do. It deliberately appeals to all that is worse in us. It is morbidity unchanged, our most base instincts let free, our nastiest fantasies realized, and it all happens, fiddling enough, in the dark. For those reasons, good liberals often shy away from horror films. For myself, I like to see the most aggressive, Dawn of the Dead, for instance, as lifting a trap door in the civilized forebrain and throwing a basket of raw meat to the hungry alligators swimming around in that subterranean river underneath. So, this is a metaphor. He's saying that all of us have some gators swimming around, and we need to feed that gator once in a while or it's going to come out. And one way you feed it is horror movies. Why? Why bother? Because it keeps them from getting out, man. It keeps them down there and me up here. It was Lennon and McCartney who said that all you need is love. Okay, my very poor rendition of a famous Beatles song, Lennon and McCartney. All you need is love. Da, 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 da. Right? A famous song. Stephen King's going to say, you don't need just love. You also have to feed your gator once in a while. And that's why he ends, as long as you keep the gators fed. I sent Mr. King an email once and I said, Mr. King, this is a wonderful essay, but I really don't like your title. It's a topic title and it's not very creative. I said a much better title would be Feeding Your Gator. He didn't respond, but I stand by the recommendation that that would be an excellent title for this piece. So what Stephen King does in this is he invites us to explore reasons, particularly the reasons of something we know really well that is maybe not really well understood by other people in our society, or people regularly get it wrong. In Classroom and in D2L, in Classroom and in D2L, there is a why prompt, and I'm going to switch to that screen so you can see the why prompt and how we use this writing both as a model for our own writing, but also the way he writes about horror movies can be how you can write about things you know really well in your own lives. Okay, so we are now on the why prompt, and this is a PowerPoint that you have access to in D2L and Google Classroom, and it walks you through some basic questions where you fill in the blank with things you know really well. The we is our culture, our society, and you can be global about that. You can be national. You could be local. Usually, the smaller the better. So why do other young first-year composition students in Michigan love blank? I recently had somebody wrote a great paper about why do we love college football the way we do. It's a wildly popular sport. It's a sport that actually, if you look at statistically, it's the most common sport that somebody would watch, and it is all over our culture. It's crazy. And why? Why do we love it? That was a great expository question to pursue. Why do we hate? I had students thinking about things that we really dislike. Why do we hate authority? Why do we hate conformity and yet often practice it? Thinking about things we despise and really why we despise them. The why do we blank is you get to put in the verb, and why don't we? I had somebody recently write a paper about why don't young people vote more often. Really explaining some of the things people don't realize about that. Thinking about what's hard is often evocative for this. Like, why is something hard to do? Why is it hard to say you're sorry? What is it about our culture that makes apologizing tough? And why are, right? Why are, usually you follow this with a noun and then a verb. So why are young women attracted to bad boys? I just had a great paper written about that. So filling in these blanks with things that you know, that you consider areas of expertise. Stephen King said, hey, I can do Why Do We Love Horror Movies? Because he really knows horror movies. What are your areas of expertise? Why do we fear? Why do we celebrate? Why do we value? Why do we obsess? Why do we encourage? So you first, as always, the question is more important than the answers initially. Start thinking of things we fear, things we celebrate, things we value, things we obsess over, things we encourage. And then what are the reasons for that phenomenon? I've shared with you also, let's see, there are now 23 slides. And these are all student-generated brainstorming answers. And I've shared them all with you. I'd like you to go back through them and look at them. In our next class, I want you to have developed some interesting why questions. So this was from my spring class. Why do we love religion? That's a great one. Why do we love memes? What are the effects of helicopter parenting? Why do we love TikTok? Right, capturing kind of really common things. Why do we love bonfires? What a great, that's a great one, right? Why do we love bonfires? That phenomenon. So look through these and think about how they evoke for you things you might know really well. And I'd like you to have 2 to 3 that you're going to share. We're going to collect them as a class, and we're going to put them in here, and we'll talk about how they could be expository questions to launch your own work at our next class. So your task was to read Stephen King's Why We Crave Horror Movies, watch this video, and then I would like you to have 2 to 3 questions where you filled in this blank with things that you think you know really well from your lives. So let's say, for instance, I'm thinking about what I know about you as students, which is pretty limited, but I can go through some of these. So why do we swim? Miles could write that paper because he was a competitive swimmer, and it's a really, really hard sport. So why? What does it do for you that can be evocative? Why do we love magic? Why do the people who play magic love it? Nicholas could explore that topic. Why are so many people still racist? Beverly's writing a lot about race and some of those kinds of things. And from her perspective, where is that coming from? Why is it there? What are some of the causes or reasons? Let's see. I'm trying to think about some topics from lifting. Okay, so why do people love lifting? Why do they become gym rats? Ryan was writing about that topic. So that's using your essay 1 ideas. You're thinking of essay 2 ideas, so you're not going to continue that same topic. I want you to think of something else. But I was modeling for you what some of those things may look like. So we're going to discuss this in class either Thursday or maybe next week. I'll have an update about that on D2L. But develop 2 or 3 questions that you think might make sense using this mode of why. So exploring causes and reasons. And always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. And thanks for watching this little video.